today we are very fortunate to have Mr. Jordan Seaberry as our speaker. I heard from people yesterday at Attleboro that they really got a lot out of it, so I'm looking forward to hearing him. Mr. Seaberry is originally from Chicago, but he ended up in New England. Happens that way. I'm from New Jersey. I ended up in New England. And he's a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. He's actually an artist in addition to being a community organizer. Right now, he is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence. Very important, and you'll hear about, they do really important work in Providence and other areas, drawing on philosophy of Dr. King and others. So without more ado, introduce Jordan Seaberry.
My great Aunt Martha turned 100 years old last month, which means she's old. But she's also really, really smart and really funny and really present. She, every day, hops on her computer and gets on Skype to talk to her sister, my grandmother. She cooks for herself, takes care of herself. She is sharp. She's present. My cousin sent me a video of her birthday celebration, and it's her sitting with this giant cake in front of her with the candles lit, and it says 100. She's sitting in front of it, and you can hear my cousin off screen say, "Well, how old are you?" And she looks at him as if it is the dumbest question she's ever heard in her entire life, as if 100 years on this earth she'd never heard anything so stupid. And she looks at him and she snarls in that way that she can do, and she says, "Well, I would guess I'm 100. And at first, seeing that video, it filled me with a lot of joy to see her so full of life, so funny, still talking the same amount of trash that she had my entire life. And in time, it started to make me feel a little sad, thinking about, in 100 years, the types of prejudice and violence that she must have seen, the types of bias she must have survived. So much has happened since she was born in 1918. She was born into a world that most of us can only imagine. We can just try to envision, to put ourselves there. She was born just before the end of World War I. She was 21 years old when Hitler marched into Poland. The truth is, my Aunt Martha lived through a lot of terror, international and here at home. She was 37 when Emmett Till was dragged, beaten, and shot. She was 50 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. More significant, I think, in tracking what has changed in our society is by looking at what hasn't. When we talk about change, we often talk about the material changes that have taken place. And things materially have changed since my Aunt Martha's time. When she was born, the male life expectancy was 47 years. 14% of homes had a bathtub. 8% of homes had a phone. The vast majority of Americans never graduated high school. Those things have changed. But what hasn't changed in her 100 years are the positions of power in our society, the way that we organize ourselves, the way we're organized as a culture, where power exists, where poverty exists. Those things remain, sadly, but unquestionably similar. So I spend most of my days with folks who are on the short end of that equation. I work, as Ron mentioned, at an organization called the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, which is a long way of saying a few different things. First and foremost, that there is a difference between study and practice, which I think is important. But in my role, in my field of public policy and systems change, it means that I am a perpetual witness. At my organization, our teams spend their afternoons on living room couches, at kitchen tables, in hospitals, funeral homes, cemeteries. We work with gang-involved youth, outreaching and building relationships with young folks who are most likely to shoot someone, get shot, or go to jail for a violent crime. At the same time, we work with the families of every homicide in the state of Rhode Island, and some from Fall River and New Bedford as well. That means whether you were a good kid at the wrong place at the wrong time, or you were someone with a mile-long rap sheet who was killed in a drug deal gone bad, regardless of your gang affiliation, offender status, criminal record, regardless of all those things, we're going to work with you. Now that tends to get us a lot of enemies because according to certain absolutist texts, like the 15th Amendment or the Bible or presidential campaign speeches, there's supposedly a visible delineation between good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. But many of us are born into a world of violence. When we seek to confront a violent world, most of us, without even thinking, do so with violence. Even those of us who seek to change the world in the bigger sense, oftentimes we resort to violence. We understand the world in binaries. It may not be right and wrong, good and evil, but oftentimes when we are confronted with the concept of nonviolence, we write it off as insufficient to combat its opposite, the overwhelming violence of our society. We perceive violence as the natural state of the universe, of the natural world. And nonviolence, therefore, is a utopian idea that might be appropriate in certain specific interpersonal situations, but is insufficient to combat the actual violence of our world. Which is weird, because we all agree that reducing violence is a good idea. Making the world a less violent place is a generally good thing. But we almost always seek to achieve that with violent means. The military, the police, the prison, war, all of these apparatuses which are violent in their nature, right or wrong, good or bad at that given moment, all of which rely on violence. These are the main forms that we use to reduce violence in our society. Structures that are inherently violent. The biggest challenge to understanding what nonviolence can actually look like as a society is imagining that a better world is even possible in the first place. So it feels ironic then that, in my experience, the folks with the greatest capacity for that imagination, the greatest capacity to imagine a nonviolent world, are the folks who are most closely related to that street-level violence that we all know so well. The gang member, the ex-felon. Folks that I've known in my work who are so close to that street-level violence and almost always wish for better, safer, more nonviolent life. The resistance to imagining that nonviolent world really comes from the folks who benefit from the status quo. People who have something to gain from the current inequality. People who have something to gain from the violence of our world. The reality is that despite countless stories to the contrary, Black Americans have long been the moral center of our nation, surviving generations of chattel slavery. Blacks endured. We resisted. We built vibrant familial structures, religious institutions, art movements. I mean, how did blacks respond to the degrading conditions of urban life? By creating the single most popular form of music in the history of mankind. How did Black Americans respond to the oppression of legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws? By creating our modern form of nonviolence. It's with a really deplorable sense of irony that America has embraced this image of the violent African American when Black Americans have demonstrated time and again that nonviolence and moral clarity have always defined the Black identity in the face of oppression. You know, identity, different from individuality, assigns us a lot in our society, good and bad. Ron mentioned I was raised in Chicago. I was raised on the south side of the city my whole life, where it is so easy to fall into traps. It is so easy to ride around with my friends, drink or smoke, get into trouble. What was hard was locking myself in my room and painting portraits and landscapes all through high school. Didn't get me a lot of friends that way. To dedicate myself to something that challenged the identity I was assigned. I came to Providence to study painting at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is where I really began to understand the importance of identity. It was on that beautiful campus where I was in class with the heiress to the Johnson & Johnson fortune, a relative of Julian Schnabel, the millionaire New York artist. As much as I defined myself as an artist internally, I was from a different world. Most of the folks that I had class with never felt the stinging humiliation of having the police called on you for trespassing while you're sitting in your own painting studio. That feeling pushed me out of RISD. I dropped out, and for 3 years, I left school. I worked first as an after-school teacher and then as a community organizer, working around prisoners' rights issues, building legislative victories. I got connected to my community because I refused to accept that the identity I had been assigned was the one I had to live with. In the end, those struggles and that work brought me back to art, crawling back to RISD and begging forgiveness. And it was at RISD, back the second time, trespassing in that studio, that I began a group of paintings that I call the Violences Project. It involved me reaching out to the families of every homicide victim from the previous year in Providence. I went to their home, sat on their couch, got to know them and the person who had been killed, overwhelmingly his son. I took their favorite photograph of the person who was killed, and I painted an oil portrait for the family. It's theirs forever. They can do with it what they like. They can hang it up, stuff it under the bed, they can pawn it, however they see fit. Then, based on the stories and the circumstances around the homicide, I paint larger paintings that collage in media coverage, police reports, photos I take inside the home, and of course, painted imagery to try to tell the full story. The idea was simple. The idea was to give a platform to stories that get ignored, to help rebuild an identity that had been taken. As an artist, the power of the picture is the power of identity, and the same is true in nonviolence. The idea of identity really became manifested for me when I started learning about an artist named Marcel Duchamp, who some of you will be familiar with. In 1917, he submitted to the Society of Independent Artists exhibit a sculpture that he entitled Fountain. Materially speaking, Fountain was just a urinal, a bathroom urinal, placed on its side with a signature scribbled on it in red that said, R. Mutt. Of course, it was rejected immediately because they had no idea what it was. But Duchamp was out to prove something important. He was out to prove that art is something that exists as such only because it is so named. Which is to say, Duchamp said, I am an artist. Because I am an artist, if I call this urinal art, it is art. Identity is important. We see this all over. We see it in fashion and entertainment, music. We see it in our most sacred institutions, government, politics, the economy, our criminal justice process. I'm the product of two identities, two legacies, white and black. On my father's side, I am the contemporary point of a history that includes slavery, sharecropping, legalized segregation, unequal schools, under-resourced neighborhoods, police brutality. The abundant beauty that exists within that history exists in spite of those things, under those pressures. On the other hand, on my mother's side, my ancestry is one of uninterrupted domination. My white ancestry in America's history is one of unmitigated and unflinching consolidation of power. We gotta pursue the truth. We gotta pursue nonviolence by looking at not only what's changed, but what has stayed the same. And we have to be honest about that, especially when it's painful, especially when it implicates us and makes us uncomfortable. Change that occurs without discomfort hasn't changed anything. When we talk about nonviolence, it's almost always in relation to the civil rights movement and segregation, slavery. But when we think about slavery, when we think about the history of slavery, I think we focus on the wrong thing. When we think of the word slavery, our mind immediately goes to the image of black bodies toiling in the fields in the hot sun. But I think when you shift the focus from the body of the slave onto the body of the master, you actually change the narrative itself. See, justice can't be achieved without honesty, truth-telling, hard as it may be. Asking, what has changed for the descendants of the master? Now, I say that not to point fingers and not to place blame. I say it because identity is important. Identity is paramount to understanding ourselves in relation to our past. I say this because certainly a lot has changed since the days of legal slavery. A lot's changed for blacks. A lot has changed for Black America since my Aunt Martha was born. We hear this all the time. Get over it. Slavery's in the past. Segregation's in the past. And we had a black president, black CEOs, black music moguls, attorney general, millionaires and billionaires. Things have changed. I didn't have anything to do with it, folks will say. Just because my great-grandparents owned slaves doesn't mean I do. I didn't ask to be born white. It just happens to be awesome. But the message is get over it. Of course, you also may be familiar with the statistic that there are currently more black people in American prisons than were ever enslaved in 1850, before the Civil War ever started. Today, you can say that there are black lives that matter, but black life does not. The reality, the truth is, the abolition of slavery robbed the South of its entire economy. There was no way for the nation to survive without free labor, so states began leasing prisoners out to work for railway contractors, farm plantations, working in mines, and suddenly it became profitable to have people in prison. The more bodies in prison, the more free labor. The more free labor, the better the economy. The better the economy, the happier the voters. That's how you build a broken country. Minorities now are overrepresented in police killings, overrepresented in mass incarceration, and overrepresented in the lifelong burdens that a criminal record brings with it. An entire second class of citizens. You replace the word colored with felon, and you have a strikingly similar picture of a contemporarily segregated society. We call that phenomenon the new Jim Crow, which some of you will be familiar with, coined by the brilliant author Michelle Alexander. The old Jim Crow described the set of laws that allowed our nation to legally segregate between the races: colored train car and white train car, colored drinking fountain, white drinking fountain, colored school, white school. Beneath the surface, this meant a deeply divided and oppressed society. Separation of the races, oppression of communities of color, law and order enforced by lynching. Now, today, Mass incarceration is our segregation. A felony record affects your ability to obtain housing, obtain educational loans, obtain government assistance. Critically, in many states, a criminal record affects your ability to vote, our most basic civic right. For an African-American man with a criminal record in Alabama, his life and the rights he has, or rather the rights he lost, may be almost exactly the same as his father, who was born into a legally segregated society. The truth is, the boom in the prison population that took place in the 80s had almost no relation to the crime rate. In the 1970s, we were talking publicly about closing prisons for good, and our prison population at the time was around 300,000 Americans. In the time since then, the prison population has expanded to be over 2.3 million Americans locked up. It's the highest incarceration rate in the world, and that doesn't even count the millions on probation and parole and other forms of supervision. But again, just as slaves were seen as the cursed ones, this is not our problem. These are people who live at the margins of our society, the dispossessed, the voiceless. In 2015, there were 991 police killings in America, of which 2% were deemed not justified. And of that 2%, only a fraction would ever move through to the criminal justice process. Police officers are protected by a labyrinth, a web of protections and deflections. Their job, a nearly impossible one, finds its only respite in its opacity. But that's not what our society should look like. It's the grinding humiliation of a violent world that makes it feel so good when we do approach a sense of justice. Michael Slager, who was convicted of killing Walter Scott, an unarmed black man who was shot in the back as he ran away. Michael Slager was convicted and sentenced recently to 20 years in federal prison for his killing. It was a huge, unprecedented moment. People called it a victory for civil rights. They were elated. And while I understand where that excitement comes from, that's a narrative that I don't think we can afford to support. Reforming a broken system has to be done nonviolently, which is to say, it can't mean just unleashing those same tools of prosecution against the people who are more culpable. It means rethinking our structure of prosecution in the first place, reevaluating our sense of justice from the beginning. If our definition of justice begins and ends with whether or not Michael Slager goes to prison for killing Walter Scott, then we are trapped, seeking liberation within the confines of the system that oppressed us in the first place. Now, if we're going to change that system, we can't do it with the same tools. We have to imagine something better. And that's what nonviolence is. The power to imagine a world that is different, that is just, that is equitable. I believe that these issues persist because we haven't committed ourselves to being an honest society with honest thinkers who are willing to get uncomfortable. When we talk about slavery or the tracing of racial oppression, it ends at crude white settlers or immoral politicians in the South. But the reality is, these principles were central tenets at the founding of our nation. That's why the question translates so well. When Thomas Jefferson asked what to do with the slave after slavery, so too are we asking what to do with the prisoner after prisons. And when I say that, I don't mean what do we do with a prisoner once her sentence is up? How do we ensure that she's reintegrated into the society and given the supports that she needs? No, I mean, what do we do with the second class of citizens that we have built, that we have condoned, after we dismantle the system that has broken their bodies and their spirits so well? That's what we should be asking ourselves. How do we address crime when police no longer have to be the default mediators of disputes? How do we settle arguments when guns are not the default tool that we use? What do we do once we acknowledge that income inequality and unemployment are not anomalies of our economic system, but fundamental functions of it? How do we distribute resources once we move past the foolish idea that income, housing, healthcare, and education are anything other than basic human rights? The reality is we have to come to understand our present situation in relation to that legacy of the master. And like I said, we don't do this to point fingers and to place blame. We do it to begin the process of telling the truth, to become an honest nation for once. We've never, as a country, been able to be truthful to ourselves, to our families, and to the legacies that we're part of. From big to small, all of the ways that we interact with each other are implicated by those untruths, complicated by our identities that exist in a history of falsehoods. My grandfather, James, was raised on a tiny plot of land in Mississippi, 3 acres, which feels like a lot in Fall River, but trust me, in Mississippi it is nothing. It's a tiny little spit of land. When you drive down Route 14, and it is hot and the air, waves in front of the car, you turn left onto this tiny little gravel road, Mahoner Road. The rocks kick up against the side of your car and tears up your tires. And eventually, I hit Lockett. And I see a little creek that my granddad told me stories about playing in when he was a kid. That's the only way I knew I was there. There's no Google Maps, no street signs. I only knew where I was because I'd been referencing the mileage I was driving alongside those giant deed books from the 1800s that I'd gone through in the county clerk's office the week before. But I found that creek that he told me so many stories about, and snakes, which he did not tell me about. Now see, me driving down there and finding that land back in 2010, that was a scary thing. Last time, before 2010, last time anyone had gone down looking for that plot of land, they had hoods on their heads. And my family never saw that house again. See, my granddad was born into a violent world. His grandparents were born slaves, and they worked on the cotton plantation just outside of Sugarlock, Mississippi. The plantation itself was a 1/10 of a mile away from where I stood at that creek. You turn your head and you look through this grove of trees and you can just see this endless field. And you ask how many lives were lost there? How many families were ended, broken in that field? See, in some places in this country, you can physically see the history of violence unfolding. After they fled Mississippi, my granddad went up to Chicago and he never left. So that's where I was born. So had it not been for that act of violence, I might have been born on a tiny farm surrounded by snakes in Mississippi, instead of being born in a metropolis known for its gang violence and its murder rate. See, as a society, we don't like to talk about our past. We don't like to talk about the ugly things we've done. We don't even like to talk about the ugly things we've survived. My granddad never told me about that night when they ran out of the house into the woods and fled up the Mississippi River. He never talked about it. There was a shame in it, even in its survival. That shame and that fear can build a legacy. But so does the truth. The truth is that we have to ignore the urge that says it is too hard to pursue justice. It is too unrealistic to pursue nonviolence. Ignore the voices that say that because this is the way things have always been, that it's the way that they're always going to be. that voice lives within the legacy of the master. That is the voice of the person who benefits from seeing our peers in jail, our parents in poverty, our grandparents' dreams dashed, and our children's futures compromised. No, the opposite of that is nonviolence. The opposite of violence is not peace. The opposite of violence is creation. Not an action, but a life, a courageous one. To do that, we have to embrace nonviolence. We have to talk about the dispossessed in a way that permeates our lives every day. The truth is that everything we value today, everything we've done and innovated as a country, is implicated by our untruths. And that is undone only by the difficult task and uncomfortable task of truth-telling. Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, Ron, we wanted to make time for questions. Is that right? Okay. Sure. If there are any questions, I'm happy to try my best to answer. Yeah.
Many of my students are criminal justice majors, and so they will be going into law enforcement. Do you have recommendations for them how they should handle certain issues that they come across? Like, they may be in Providence, they could be in New Bedford, they could be in Fall River or in this general area. And I personally worry for their safety. They don't as much as I do, but I wondered if you could give them some practical advice, especially coming from Chicago.
Absolutely. Was everyone able to hear the question? Okay. So talking about the arrangement of police, more than anything else, I think what I always urge police officers, and we have a really close working relationship with the Providence Police Department and the Rhode Island State Police Department, because we have to. We're trying to save lives and keep folks safe. But we also recognize that the arrangement can change. The way that we organize policing in this country is within a legacy that we don't like to talk about. There are the majority of police on the majority of police forces enter that role with the best intentions of keeping their community safe, of protecting those that they care about, of maintaining the dignity of the communities that they're a part of. Those are noble intentions. But we've set up policing in a way where that becomes virtually impossible to maintain. We've arranged our relationship to policing where it is so hard not to be antagonistic. You're trained to walk up to the side of a car with your hand on your holster. You're trained to encounter communities, particularly urban communities of color and low-income communities, as if they are war zones. We treat police as if they're paramilitary, and they don't have to be. We have federal incentives for arrest rates, which virtually forces police officers. It gives them a financial quota to go after what's called low-hanging fruit, low-level, street-level drug dealers or thieves or whatever the case may be. And you automatically build this antagonistic relationship that has to be, in order to reach that quota, has to be based on bias, has to be based on harassment, has to be based on approaching everyone as a suspect. If we're going to allow and build a structure for the good folks who go into policing for the right reasons, we have to change the structure of it, because the chips are stacked against them. We have embraced the idea of militarization of police across the country, even small departments. We saw in Ferguson approaching the majority nonviolent protests with tanks and the LRAD sonar weapon and assault rifles. I mean, the fact that we have approached our society that way and arranged police in a way where they have to view themselves as paramilitary. They have to view themselves as antagonists. That's what really has to change. So to the folks who are current criminal justice majors and hoping to go into law enforcement, I absolutely wish you the best. I hope you maintain those good intentions. But I also urge you to recognize that you are stepping into a legacy that you have to fight. You have to challenge day in and day out, because it will swallow you. If you're not careful, if you're not conscious, it will be easy to be an antagonist. It will be easy to approach everyone as if they're a suspect. It is hard to see everyone as a full human. It is hard to consider the background and the challenges that folks have when you encounter them at their worst moment. Police don't get called when folks get an A in class or when they do something thoughtful for their mother. They get called at their worst moments. And so it is your job to maintain that nonviolent vision that folks are not just the worst thing they've done. Just because you have stolen something does not mean you are just a thief. Just because you have hit someone does not mean you are just a batterer. We as a society haven't allowed police to see folks that way very often. And if you're going into that field, you have to keep that close to your heart. It's too hard not to. Oh, yeah.
Yes, how you doing? One of the things I'm focused on is the retention of black males in education. So coming from my family, just as yours, was a family that was in bondage also, out of Georgia. Okay? I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. And one of the things that I look at right now compared to the early 1900s all the way to about the 1960s, how education for blacks, especially in the South, was a very important thing. But something has transitioned, which has hurt us very bad. The retention of black males in universities. And it's not only universities, it's high schools also. I was just recently in Providence taking a look at that. You know, it's just as bad there in Providence and Boston as it is in Atlanta, Georgia, or Greensboro, North Carolina. What are some of the things we could do to change that? Because we actually need to have those black doctors in the community, those black lawyers, as we're speaking about lawyers in the community. We need to have a better educated community than what we have now. I mean, think about it, from 1900s all the way to about the 1960s to the Civil Rights Movement. And then a complete turnaround to, I don't want to go to school, I just want a job. I mean, it's a total change. And then here you're looking at HBCUs, historical black colleges and universities, which many students up here don't know very much about. And how they are losing a lot of students, especially black males. The incarceration rate is going up like crazy. And being incarcerated, someone else is getting paid off of it.
You're right.
So the thing is can you give me a vision or insight on what can help that situation? Because I'm doing my best in trying to. I'm not trying to create more athletes. I'm trying to create more thinkers. Because we have enough athletes. We already know we can play basketball.
Well, I can't, but yeah.
So, it is taking those brothers that who are just want to be rappers and all of that, but who want to be in those fights.
So this is a really good question, and I think a more complicated one than folks might realize. There's really a twofold answer to it. On the one hand, every community needs mentors and role models and folks who are in positions of success and education and a type of self-actualization that can serve as an example to the next generation. That is true across race lines, class lines, religions. Every community needs that. But I think education is tricky for a couple of reasons. One, it is one of the few fields that is so shrouded within its own complex policy that the vast majority of folks actually have no idea how it functions. Education policy is something that is such a complicated field that it's really hard for folks to get a nuanced, full picture of how it operates. The reality is that that's complicated then by its legacy. Education has always been pitted as the liberator, the great equalizer, that which can raise folks up to success and build opportunity for anyone. And I imagine that's why some folks are here in this building now, because we believe that we can do better by bettering ourselves, and we can better our communities that way. Education has, public education and state-sponsored education has a tougher, more nuanced history than that. Education has always been used as a double-edged sword, as both an equalizer and a liberator, and also as a weapon. Think back to colonization of native tribes, particularly in the Southwest and the southern parts of the country. Education, white settlers knew at the time that education was the best way to break the culture, the familial bonds, and the societies that native tribes had built. So they forced entire tribes to go into boarding schools, what they called boarding schools, but really were these assimilation camps. They had to straighten their hair, cut it, and comb it. They had to wear white Western clothing. They had to learn about Christianity. All of these things, they were not allowed to speak Dene or Navajo or whatever language they spoke. All of these things were within the educational model to better these individuals. But really, it was a weapon to destroy that culture. And so we've got this tricky history. We've got this really, really tricky history where today we see these extremely segregated public schools. In my hometown, we closed down countless schools in Black and Latino communities, and nothing seems to occur in the upper class white neighborhoods of Chicago, which is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so we stratify and stratify and stratify, and education, which is supposed to be this equalizer and liberator, becomes this primary way to actually stratify a society until, you're right, the value of education gets lost. If it's unavailable to me and it becomes this place that is infested with gang violence, where I know my ceilings are crumbling and the windows don't shut all the way and I'm cold, of course we begin to value that differently. It becomes a part of that cultural conditioning that we have to fight against. So I think it's twofold. Yes, we need more educated mentors in the community. We need folks to give that example, but we also can't lose sight of the policy battle within it, because those are fixable. We just have to know what we're fighting, and we have to dig our heels in to fight that battle. Yeah.
My son was going actually to a public school, and we lived in Marion.
Mhm.
I had to take him out because he was not learning. Do you think a collaborative school and public school diverses people with disabilities?
So I think you're talking about the charter model.
Yes.
So the charter model is a tricky one, right? I think there are enough data sets showing that charter schools can be innovative and can address certain types of really nuanced needs that public schools may not have the funding for. But at the end of the day, as a system, and again, I always go back to the big picture, the idea of the charter school fundamentally undercuts the idea of the public school. And so when you create that dichotomy, even though in the present moment, I'll admit, charters may have a little more flexibility and more ability to meet certain specific needs of students, and it sounds like that might be your experience. But when we build that system, in a few generations, we're going to find that our lack of investment in public schools and our lack of seriousness about the need for education, particularly in low-income communities where schools are virtually forgotten and literally crumbling. When we build that separate system, I think in a couple generations we're going to realize that the answer was always investing in meaningful support for public schools, which really, really should be the best way for our children to interact with one another, gain experience from other communities, build with one another, and educate themselves. So, kind of a yes and no. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering how much you see an issue with the fact that we seem to have certain areas in the country, certain urban areas. My sister lives in the south side of Chicago.
Okay.
I'm a little familiar with what you're talking about. And I spent a year living in San Antonio on the west side,
Mhm.
working with the Mexican American community. And in both of those places, there seems to be a problem that the people who are considered to have made it or to have been successful are the people who get out, the people who leave.
Right.
So what do we do? What's your idea what we should do with these communities that are left with, I'm sure, some people who care about the community and who want to see it get better, but places where people who are tired of the way things are don't stay and fix it, they take off and go somewhere else. So how do we combat that and make people stay who have the tools to work with the community?
That's a really good question. And that sort of highlights the trick of our economic system. Right? We say all the time, in America, anybody can make it. And there is some truth to that. There are tons of rags to riches stories and folks who come from a really poor background and achieve great wealth, or really, marginalized, obscure existence and reach huge heights of fame. So arguably, you can say anybody can make it, but that's not where I want to be. That's not the world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a world where anybody can make it. I want to live in a world where everybody can make it. That's what nonviolence really is about. That's seeing that our system may make certain exceptions and may allow for the rising of certain individuals who maybe are lucky or maybe have privileges to fall back on, but that is not enough. That is not good enough. And so when we see particularly urban communities where folks reach this level of success and then essentially flee, it's easy to blame those individuals. But what we don't often realize is that by blaming those individuals for not sticking around and not fixing what's wrong with the community, which, is a fair argument, but we're placing the onus on the people who were oppressed by that neighborhood. What we really can do is build people power to fight those structural issues in the first place, so that it's not the individual's responsibility to fix a community. It is reliant within the power of the people, which is the only way things change anyway. But when we expect those few folks that, our economy plucks up and says, you can make it, when we expect those folks to be the ones to come back and fix it, we're actually reinforcing that narrative that it's okay for only a few folks to make it, that it's okay for there to be these, superstar exceptions, when a nonviolent frame means that that is not okay. Everybody has to be able to reach that. Everybody has to be on that same level if we're going to have an equitable society. So the answer, and my answer to many questions, will be people power. Yeah.
So, I asked quite a few people, I'm a criminal justice major, and I also have lived the lifestyle. I am the ex-con, the felon, the recovering addict, and so a domestic violence. So any part of trauma I've had in my life, but I've worked hard and still working hard to change my life and now help society. And since I've been at this school, I was more educated, and you're being from Chicago. The only thing that I've ever heard about Chicago was the highest homicide rate.
Right.
So, thank you for the enlightenment of other things going on there, and it was very powerful to hear about your aunt, did you say?
Yes, my great aunt, yeah.
That was powerful.
Well, I appreciate that.
So I've asked people and I always word very carefully because in low poverty communities, Black communities, how do we solve the problem of violence within the community? Because there's a lot of violence within African Americans themselves.
You can say it, it's okay.
Like I said, I word very carefully because we're all trying to be politically correct. I'm actually in a biracial relationship, so I'm not prejudiced, so, but I try to be careful. So I was told, and I said, why is there so much violence? And in my education here, I learned, you know, obviously it's respect in gangs, or a single parent, or there's no parent. The parents are absent, so kids go to gangs to get respect, to get acceptability, to get a family because their family isn't present. And then that brings on some violence, and then the poverty, the struggle, the need for survival to get money, and that brings on drug dealing, committing crimes to feed your family. So how do we stop it?
So if I may, first dispel a couple myths. The majority of folks who are in prison across the country are there for drug crimes.
Yes.
Drug dealing, illegal drug dealing, and illegal drug use is virtually equal across racial lines. So let me dispel that myth right off the bat, that there is the idea of the black drug dealer is every bit as prevalent as the white drug dealer. The reason that we perceive it differently is twofold. One, urban communities are physically dense. We have piled folks literally on top of each other, which means when you have a concentration of people and you have a concentration of poverty, it becomes more evident, it becomes more visible. Secondly, when we choose to use our main apparatus of violence reduction, which is policing, when we pick and choose to strategically target certain communities, suddenly we find exactly what we were looking for. If there were SWAT raids on the Brown University campus, I guarantee you they would find plenty of illegal narcotics in any given building on the campus. But they don't choose to do that. They choose instead to go into low-income communities, communities of color, to reach those quotas, to hit that low-hanging fruit. And so part of it is structural, and part of it is in regards to how we have arranged, again, it comes back to that arrangement of policing, how we build out this antagonistic relationship, where we choose to look for crime, where we choose to look, and what we choose to value as truly criminal. A kid, on campus smoking pot, we might not view that as criminal. But someone sitting on their porch in the hood, rolling a joint, that might be criminal, right? We perceive these things differently, and that filters into how we police it. And so part of it is literally a myth. Now, the other thing about gang violence, which accounts for a relatively small proportion of violence across the country, particularly gun violence, what that hits is a type of disenfranchisement that urban communities have felt, and that is an intentional disenfranchisement. It is not accidental. It is not just some anomaly of history. Projects, high-rises that pit folks against one another, pile literally thousands and thousands of people on top of each other with no resources, no support, no job opportunities, no grocery stores or rec centers. Those were virtually all made in response to race riots in the 60s as an intentional way to break that strain of black liberation, the awakening of communities of color that took place in the 60s. So the same way education can be used as a weapon, housing can also be used as a weapon, and it has been successfully. So the ways in which we arrange our cities, when black folks were no longer able to be segregated against within towns, and white communities fled, ran literally into suburbs and into more rural areas, devastating the economies. And then we act surprised when there's rampant poverty. So violence is not a self-sustaining idea, right? It is not something that we choose. It is not the natural state of the world. It is something we're conditioned to believe makes sense for our conditions. It's something that we have been trained to accept as a reasonable way to approach the world.
So how can we low poverty areas. I've heard of youth clubs, things like that. How do we get to the pit of the problem and help the whole community to rise?
So first and foremost, how do we help a low-income community? We switch our definition of what help is, right? We often have this idea that we will enter into a low-income community and set up a nonprofit and save the poor black children. But this idea dominates, tons of organizations and tons of initiatives across the country. And the idea has to be self-determination. The idea has to be building the power and the capacity of those communities internally. It has to be about empowering the people who are most directly affected. We are not going to reform the prison system, for example, without having at the forefront of that struggle people who are and have been incarcerated. We are not going to change sexism in the workplace without the empowerment of women at the forefront of that struggle. We are not going to reach any type of racial equality or liberation without the folks who are most directly affected by that oppression at the forefront of it. Every time we talk about helping or changing another community, we have to find a way to empower that community first. They have to be at the forefront of it, or it will not work. Saviors don't work. I see your hand. Since you asked one, I want to get someone else first, then I'll hop right back to you.
Now,
Yep.
you're talking about building a community together, right? This isn't a question, it's just my opinion. And I believe that essentially I live in Florida, so essentially it comes down to greed, first of all. The political aspect of the city is completely flawed. I think they direct their income, not vast majority, on the low-income properties. Because, like I said, I'm from Florida, so the drugs is outrageous. The jobs are outrageous. A lot of people in the communities don't want to come together as a community and make it work. I've been to multiple community meetings to where the majority of the people, even if it's more dominant black in a specific community, the majority of the people are white, elderly. And I think they are trying their hardest to better their community, but again, coming from the police aspect, and the most important thing in the police department is community policing. Right? You want to get involved with the community, you want to ask them, put them together, ask them, hey, what do you guys need in order to better your community? And a lot of people, they find it, I think it's greed and laziness. A lot of people find it that it's easy to stay at home, collect a check, and not get income, by themselves, go out there and get income. A lot of people are ignorant in the fact of how to get a job. A lot of people don't know. I think essentially we need to start at a younger age, and I know a lot of you say this, pay the teachers more, the professors more, get more people to be inspired to help the younger. Because a lot of people, when they want to go out and get jobs, they think of what can better my life, you know what I mean? And a lot of professors and teachers are low, they don't get as much income as I believe they should. So I think they need to raise the income of the professors, they need to have more guidance counselors, they need to have more people who are inspired to teach the young. So we can start there. There's a starting point to it. But I also think that once people as a community come together, and I've seen it, I've seen people see trashed areas in the city, I've seen people try to come together and make it better, clean up, the city. I think it needs to start from the higher level, like as far as politics, and then it needs to go to the children. It needs to be a vast majority of things. Start somewhere, start small, make it big, and make everyone, come together to make the city good. It's just, I think that a lot of people are very reliable on handouts. And, I've witnessed people just be like, I'm living fine just by getting this government income. You know what I mean? And I think they need to be educated on how to get a job, how to do better with their lives. And I just think that that's where our problem is as a society, as a community, that we need to educate more people, we need to help others out, and we need to, have everyone come together. No violence, just as a group. We're people. We're not white, black, Mexican. We're Americans. You know what I mean? And I think that needs to change.
So I want to address a few of your points quickly. One, you are right. We need to invest more in our schools. Teachers need to be paid more. It needs to be a profession that is valued. But it goes back to a structural issue. One of the reasons that the teaching profession is underpaid and undervalued is because, at least at the high school and grade school age, it is a field primarily operated by women. And so the society, our society, we have chosen not to value that work. And that is a structural inequity that can be fixed. So I agree with you that we need to fix that. I want to challenge, however, the idea, which we hear a lot about folks accepting handouts and the sort of laziness of taking a check and not pursuing work for themselves. I think this goes back to the point about how we police, right? How we look for crime, what we value as crime, what we value as violent and not violent. When we talk about folks that we see, maybe in our families or in our friend network, who we characterize as that type of lazy, right? They're collecting a check, they don't want to get a job, whatever the case may be. That's a value judgment that we can change. I have met plenty of folks who don't work and who are on government assistance. I've never met one of them who wasn't creative, who wasn't doing some type of work within their family or their community or empowering the folks around them. But we don't value that work. We don't call that work. I've never met someone who was in a low-income community, unable to work or uninterested in working, who hadn't experienced some type of violence and trauma. And that can be structural too. The reaction of, I don't want to do anything, I want to just sit and be on my own, that is a trauma response. That is not the natural state of folks to approach their lives. And so when we see that, it's easy for folks to judge and say, oh, well, you're lazy. You don't want to get a job. You don't want to do this. You don't want to do that. But when we begin to see them as whole people, which is what I think police and everyone in positions of power needs to do, we begin to understand that we are a part of a traumatized legacy. Urban life, living under the conditions of our economy, which is an economy of taking and resource extraction, our economy is a traumatizing economy. Our political system is a traumatizing political system. Our society is a violent and traumatizing one. And so the idea then, when you approach it that way, it's not at all surprising that folks might have a response to that trauma. I've worked with folks who have lost a loved one and are incapable of leaving the house for months and sometimes years on end. We wouldn't judge that as irrational. We wouldn't point fingers and place blame because we understand where that trauma comes from. It's more immediate. We can see it. At the same time, I can think of one mother who lost her son on a Friday, and she was at work on Monday because that was her way to heal herself. So everybody has a different response to trauma, but when we understand these communities as traumatized, I think we can change the way we judge that action because it is a traumatized response. But I hear your point. Yeah.
Obama had said at one time during the riots in my city, as you know, Baltimore is one of the highest crime rated places, always along Chicago, if not higher. I grew up in that.
Yep.
Okay? And during all those riots and everything, Obama came out and said, don't act as if this is something new between police officers and the community. There's never anything new. I remember all of that stuff. I'm an immigrant up here, only been up here a couple of years. And I tell you, this is the most laid-back thing in the world. I sleep very good. I think I'm getting younger. One of the things that I did realize was this here. When I was back home in Baltimore, I don't know how many people lived in trauma. Yes, she speaks trauma and all of that, but I'm going to take it further. We used to say on the streets, dealing with the police, because they were so bad, we used to say that we live in terrorism. Urban people living in terrorism on a constant basis. You go across the street, you have a police you have a police car of 5 officers. 2 jump out while you're just carrying a box of T-shirts to your car. And then they want to frisk you. Same thing happening in Boston. Terror wizard. So as the young man was stating about we all are American, if you can live that way and then think about America, you won't think about American being American like that. Because a lot of people, even whites that I remember growing up with that were in poverty, true poverty, even they would say, am I really an American? Is this America? This is what America is about. That's what it does when you don't have much of nothing. We always talk about the things of, okay, well, this person here is lazy, this person here is on welfare, or with blacks, it's so much crime in the black community. That is not true to me, because we're a culture that sticks together, and we live by a code. If you're involved in drugs, then you get the consequences of the drugs. But if you're involved in education or you're trying to start a business, even the drug dealer gives you that respect. It's not what the media puts out there about us. It's not any of that. And I grew up hearing that so much. Even when I moved up here, it's not very many. I live in Fall River. There's not very many blacks in this community that I can identify with, especially when they come from the South. But I have identified with a lot of Africans. And I'm just now learning about Cape Verde, and I did not know. I'm sorry, Cape Verde. I didn't know about you because you didn't come down there. You know, if you showed up, I probably would have talked to you. But I'm learning a whole lot, you know, about the diversity of blacks that are here versus being down south, that where if you're of slavery descent, that's pretty much the ones that you're going to come across.
Right.
So with me being up here, I'm learning a lot, and I'm also trying to educate the ones that who really haven't been anywhere and seen the terrorism or haven't experienced it yet. Because it's going on over in Providence. I done seen a bit of it going on there, and it's going on over in Boston, but it hasn't reached here yet. I got a pretty good police officer around here. We smile, we even go to the store and have little donut cakes. That would not happen in Baltimore.
I think that's an excellent point, Ron. How are we doing on time?
Well, that's the last question.
Okay. I think that's an excellent point and a great place to end, because it highlights the fact that change is possible. You can see little glimpses of it here and there. And I encourage folks who are going into that field to remember that. But it still exists within that structure, and that is what we have to change. But thanks, everybody.